Dr. B.R. Ambedkar on Caste, Part 4. Similar in argument is the theory that the Brahmins created the caste. After what I have said regarding Manu, I need hardly say anything more except to point out that it is incorrect in thought and malicious in intent. The Brahmins may have been guilty of many things, and I dare say they were, but the imposing of the caste system on the non-Brahmin population was beyond their mettle. They may have helped the process by their glib philosophy, but they certainly could not have pushed their scheme beyond their own confines, to fashion society after one's own pattern. How glorious! How hard! One can take pleasure and eulogize its furtherance, but cannot further it very far. The vehemence of my attack may seem to be unnecessary, but I can assure you that it is not uncalled for. There is a strong belief in the mind of Orthodox Hindus that the Hindu society was somehow molded into the framework of the caste system and that it is an organization consciously created by the Shastras. Not only does this belief exist, but it is being justified on the ground that it cannot but be good because it is ordained by the Shastras and the Shastras cannot be wrong. I have urged so much on the adverse side of this attitude, not because the religious sanctity is grounded on scientific basis, nor to help those reformers who are preaching against it. Preaching did not make the caste system, neither will it unmake it. My aim is to show the falsity of the attitude that has exalted religious sanction to the position of a scientific explanation. Thus, the great man theory does not help us very far in solving the spread of caste in India. Western scholars, probably not much given to hero worship, have attempted other explanations. The nuclei round which have formed the various castes in India are, according to them, 1. Occupation, 2. Survivals of tribal organizations, etc., 3. The rise of new belief, 4. Crossbreeding, and 5. Migration. The question may be asked whether these nuclei do not exist in other societies and whether they are peculiar to India. If they are not peculiar to India but are common to the world, why is it that they did not form caste on other parts of this planet? Is it because those parts are holier than the land of the Vedas, or that the professors are mistaken? I am afraid that the latter is the truth. In spite of the high theoretic value claimed by the several authors for their respective theories based on one or other of the above nuclei, one regrets to say that on close examination, they are nothing more than filling illustrations, what Matthew Arnold means by the grand name without the grand thing in it. Such are the various theories of caste advanced by Sir Daniel Ibbotson, Mr. Nesfield, Mr. Sennett, and Sir H. Risley. To criticize them in a lump would be to say that they are disguised form of the petitio principii of formal logic. To illustrate, Mr. Nesfield says that function and function only was the foundation upon which the whole system of caste in India was built up. But he may rightly be reminded that he does not very much advance our thought by making the above statement, which practically amounts to saying that castes in India are functional or occupational, which is a very poor discovery. We have yet to know from Mr. Nesfield why is it that an occupational group turned into an occupational caste. I would very cheerfully have undertaken the task of dwelling on the theories of other ethnologists, had it not been for the fact that Mr. Nesfield's is a typical one. Without stopping to criticize those theories that explain the caste system as a natural phenomena occurring in obedience to the law of disintegration, as explained by Herbert Spencer in his formula of evolution, or as natural as the structural differentiation within an organism, to employ the phraseology of orthodox apologists, or as an early attempt to test the laws of eugenics, as all belonging to the same class of fallacy, which regards the caste system as inevitable or as being consciously imposed in anticipation of these laws on a helpless and humble population, I will now lay before you my own view on the subject. We shall be well advised to recall at the outset that the Hindu society, in common with other societies, was composed of classes, and the earliest known are first the Brahmins or the priestly class, second the Kshatriya or the military class, third the Vaishya or the merchant class, and fourth the Shudra or the artisan and manual class. Particular attention has to be paid to the fact that this was essentially a class system in which individuals, when qualified, could change their class, and therefore classes did change their personnel. At some time in the history of the Hindus, the priestly class socially detached itself from the rest of the body of people and through a closed-door policy became a caste by itself. The other classes, being subject to the law of social division of labor, underwent differentiation, some into large, others into very minute groups. The Vaishya and Shudra classes were the original inchoate plasm, which form the sources of the numerous castes of today. As a military occupation does not very easily lend itself to very minute subdivision, the Kshatriya class could have differentiated into soldiers and administrators. This subdivision of a society is quite natural, but the unnatural thing about these subdivisions is that they have lost the open door character of the class system and have become self-enclosed units called caste. The question is, were they compelled to close their doors and become endogamous, or did they close them of their own record? I submit that there is a double line of answer. Some closed the door, others found it closed against them. The one is a psychological interpretation and the other is mechanistic, but they are complementary and both are necessary to explain the phenomena of caste formation in its entirety. I will first take up the psychological interpretation. The question we have to answer in this connection is, why did these subdivisions or classes, if you please, industrial, religious or otherwise, become self-enclosed or endogamous? My answer is because the Brahmins were so. Endogamy or the closed-door system was a fashion in the Hindu society, and as it had originated from the Brahmin caste, it was wholeheartedly imitated by all the non-Brahmin subdivisions or classes who, in their turn, became endogamous caste. It is the infection of imitation that caught all these subdivisions on their onward march of differentiation and has turned them into caste. The propensity of imitate is a deep-seated one in the human mind and need not be deemed an inadequate explanation for the formation of the various castes in India. It is so deep-seated that Walter Begehot argues that we must not think of imitation as voluntary or even conscious. On the contrary, it has its seat mainly in very obscure parts of the mind whose notions, so far from being consciously produced, are hardly felt to exist, so far from being conceived beforehand, are not even felt at that time. The main seat of the imitative part of our nature is our belief and the causes predisposing us to believe this or disinclining us to believe that are among the obscurest parts of our nature. But as to the imitative nature of credulity, there can be no doubt. This propensity to imitate has been made the subject of a scientific study by Gabriel Tarde, who lays down 3 laws of imitation. One of his 3 laws is that imitation flows from the higher to the lower, or, to quote his own words, given the opportunity, a nobility will always and everywhere imitate its leaders, its kings or sovereigns, and the people likewise. Given the opportunity, its nobility. Another of Tarde's laws of imitation is that the extent or intensity of imitation varies inversely in proportion to distance, or in his own words, The thing that is most imitated is the most superior one of those that are nearest. In fact, the influence of the model's example is efficacious inversely to its distance as well as directly to its superiority. Distance is understood here in its sociological meaning. However, distant in space, a stranger may be, he is close by from this point of view if we have numerous and daily relations with him and if we have every facility to satisfy our desire to imitate him. This law of the imitation of the nearest, of the least distant, explains the gradual and consecutive character of the spread of an example that has been set by the higher social ranks. In order to prove my thesis, which really needs no proof, that some castes were formed by imitation, the best way, it seems to me, is to find out whether or not the vital conditions for the formation of caste by imitation exist in the Hindu society. The conditions for imitation, according to the standard authority, are first, that the source of imitation must enjoy prestige in the group, and second, that there must be numerous and daily relations among members of a group. That these conditions were present in India, there is little reason to doubt. The Brahmin is a semi-god and very nearly a demigod. He sets up a mode and molds the rest. His prestige is unquestionable and is the fountainhead of bliss and good. Can such a being, idolized by scriptures and venerated by the priest-ridden multitude, fail to project his personality on the suppliant humanity? Why, if the story be true, he is believed to be the very end of creation. Such a creature is worthy of more than mere imitation, but at least of imitation, and if he lives in an endogamous enclosure, should not the rest follow his example? Frail humanity. Be it embodied in a grave philosopher or a frivolous housemaid, it succumbs. It cannot be otherwise. Imitation is easy and invention is difficult. Yet another way of demonstrating the play of imitation in the formation of caste is to understand the attitude of non-Brahmin classes towards those customs which supported the structure of caste in its nascent days until, in the course of history, it became embedded in the Hindu mind and hangs there to this day without any support, for now it needs no prop but belief, like a weed on the surface of a pond. In a way, but only in a way, the status of a caste in the Hindu society varies directly with the extent of the observance of the customs of sati, enforced widowhood, and girl marriage. But observance of these customs varies directly with the distance. I am using the word in the Tardian sense that separates the caste. Those castes that are nearest to the Brahmins have imitated all the three customs and insist on the strict observance thereof. Those that are less near have imitated enforced widowhood and girl marriage. Others, a little farther off, have only girl marriage, and those farthest off have imitated only the belief in the caste principle. This imperfect imitation, I dare say, is due partly to what Tade calls distance and partly to the barbarous character of these customs. This phenomena is a complete illustration of Tade's law, and leaves no doubt that the whole process of caste formation in India is a process of imitation of the higher by the lower. At this juncture, I will turn back to support a former conclusion of mine, which might have appeared to you as too sudden or unsupported. I said that the Brahmin class first raised the structure of caste by the help of those three customs in question. My reason for that conclusion was that their existence in other classes was derivative. After what I have said regarding the role of imitation in the spread of these customs among the non-Brahmin caste as means or as ideals, though the imitators have not been aware of it, they exist among them as derivatives, and if they are derived, they must have been prevalent one original caste. There must have been prevalent one original caste that was high enough to have served as a pattern for the rest. But in a theocratic society, who could be the pattern but the servant of God? This completes the story of those that were weak enough to close their doors. Let us now see how others were closed in as a result of being closed out. This I call the mechanistic process of the formation of caste. It is mechanistic because it is inevitable. That this line of approach, as well as the psychological one, to the explanation of the subject has escaped my predecessors is entirely due to the fact that they have conceived caste as a unit by itself and not as one within a system of castes. The result of this oversight or lack of sight has been very detrimental to the proper understanding of the subject matter and therefore its correct explanation. I will proceed to offer my own explanation by making one remark which I will urge you to bear constantly in mind. It is this, that caste in the singular number is an unreality. Caste exists only in the plural number. There is no such thing as a caste. There are always castes. To illustrate my meaning, while making themselves into a caste, the Brahmins by virtue of this created non-Brahmin caste, or to express it in my own way, while closing themselves in, they close others out. I will clear my point by taking another illustration. Take India as a whole with its various communities designated by the various creeds to which they owe allegiance, to wit, the Hindus, Mohammedans, Jews, Christians, and Parsis. Now, bearing the Hindus, the rest within themselves are non-caste communities. But with respect to each other, they are caste. Again, if the first four enclose themselves, the Parsis are directly closed out, but are indirectly closed in. Symbolically, if Group A wants to be endogamous, Group B has to be so by sheer force of circumstances. Now apply the same logic to the Hindu society and you have another explanation of the Fissiparous character of caste as a consequence of the virtue of self-duplication that is inherent in it. Any innovation that seriously antagonizes the ethical, religious and social code of the caste is not likely to be tolerated by the caste, and the recalcitrant members of a caste are in danger of being thrown out of the caste. And the recalcitrant members of a caste are in danger of being thrown out of the caste and left to their own fate without having the alternative of being admitted into or absorbed by other castes. Caste rules are inexorable and they do not wait to make nice distinctions between kinds of offense. Innovation may be of any kind, but all kinds will suffer the same penalty. A novel way of thinking will create a new caste, for the old ones will not tolerate it. The noxious thinker, respectfully called guru or prophet, suffers the same fate as the sinners in illegitimate love. The former creates a caste of the nature of a religious sect, and the latter a type of mixed caste. Castes have no mercy for a sinner who has the courage to violate the code. The penalty is excommunication, and the result is a new caste. It is not peculiar Hindu psychology that induces the excommunicated to form themselves into a caste. Far from it. On the contrary, very often they have been quite willing to be humble members of some caste higher by preference if they could be admitted within its fold. But castes are enclosed units, and it is their conspiracy with clear conscience that compels the excommunicated to make themselves into a caste. The logic of this obdurate circumstance is merciless, and it is in obedience to its force that some unfortunate groups find themselves enclosed because others in enclosing themselves have closed them out, with the result that new groups form on any basis obnoxious to the caste rules by a mechanical law are constantly being converted into caste to a bewildering multiplicity. Thus is told the second tale in the process of caste formation in India.